Good day everyone. For today's lesson is about Greek literature. I am Ruby and Iran together with my group mates Jaire Lairol, Hilo Edwin, and Lovely Love Now, Francesca. For the table of contents, we have A for the introduction, overview and background about Greek literature, B for Greek gods and goddesses, 12 Olympians, C for the Trojan War, and D for 8 brief tales. Objectives. In this lesson, the students will be able to know and understand the Greek literature, be familiarized with the Greek gods and goddesses, 12 Olympians, learn and understand the story of the Trojan War, and 8 brief tales. So first, let's start with the Greek literature. So Greek literature is a body of writing in a Greek language with a continuous history extending from the first millennium BC to the present day. So from the beginning, ang writer ng Greek literature is not only people who live in Greece but also in the Asian Minor. So after the conquest of Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great is known as a Macedonian king who conquered the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, the Middle East, and parts of Asia in a remarkable short period of time. So literature was Greek literature was produced not only over a much wider area but also by those whose mother tongue. And Greek literature can be divided into distinct periods. We have Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic. Next, we have Ancient Greek literature. So, Ancient Greek literature is an ancient literature which is written in an ancient language from the earliest texts until the time of the Byzantine Empire. So, ancient literature is only a relatively small proportion survived, yet it remains important, not only because much of it of supreme quality, but also because until the mid-19th century, the greater part of the literature of the Western was produced by writers who were familiar with the Greek tradition. So was what I've said earlier, that the Greek literature is the writers were not only living in the Greece itself but also in the Asian Minor. So we expect that there are people who was familiar with the Greek tradition, and either directly or through the medium of Latin, who were conscious that the forms they used were mostly on the invention and took for granted in the readers some familiarity with the classical literature. Next, let's move on to the Greek literature that divides into distinct periods. So we have here Archaic period to the end of the 6th century, Classical period 5th and 4th century BC, Hellenistic and Greco-Roman periods end of the 4th to the end of the 1st century BC. Okay, first we have the Greek literature, Archaic period. So in Archaic period is the Greeks created the poetry, and beginning it was intended to be sung or recited. So before it was made, writing for the literary purpose. So one that arises from the Archaic period is the poetry, which is intended to be sung and recited. So the art of writing naman is known in the 7th century BC, and among subject nila is about myth, part legend based, sometimes on the memory of historical events, part of folk tales, and part of religious speculation. So the two great poems na nagstanding in the beginning of Greek literature is the Iliad and Odyssey, retelling the intermingled history of myth and Mycenaean age. So in the Archaic era, so mostly centered nila is about the myth, part of the history and folklore. So but since yung myth is yung pinaka-subject is not associated with any religious dogma, even though they often treated God and heroic mortals, they were not authoritative and could be varied in the poet to express the new concept. So next we have Classical period. So in the Classical period, true tragedy was created by Aeschylus and continued by Sophocles and Euripides. So this three person is a tragedian. Tragedian is known who is an actor or a writer of tragedy or tragic roles. So, Aristophanes and the greatest of the comedic poet lived on to the half of 4th century, but the old comedy did not survive to the fall of Athens in 404. So the sublime themes in the Aeschylean tragedy in which human beings stand answerable to the gods and receive all expiring insight to divine purpose were exemplified in the three plays of the orchestra. So the old comedy, so we also have here the Old Comedy. So the Old Comedy of Aristophanes was established later than tragedy but preserved more obvious traces on its origin and ritual for the vigor, wit, and intensity with which it keenly satirized public issues and prominent persons clearly derived from the rivalry of the Dionysian festival. So, in classical period, ang nag-arise is tragedy, comedy, and the Old Comedy. So, in the tragedy, naman Sophocles made the progress towards both dramatic complexity with naturalness, while remaining orthodox in the treatment of religious and moral issues. So, you see, Euripides handled his theme naman on the plane of skeptical enlightenment, endowed tradition, and picture of the gods. So, next we have Hellenistic Greco-Roman period. So, the huge empire of Alexander the Great, Macedonians and Greek composed the new governing class, and Greek became the language of administration and the culture, a new composite dialect based on some extent on Attic and called the Koine or common language. So, everywhere the traditional city-state was in decline and individuals were becoming aware of their isolation and were seeking consolidation and satisfaction outside the corporate society, artistic creation now came under private patronage, and expect for Athenian comedy composition were intended for a small select audience that admire polish, erudition, and subtlety. So, in Hellenistic period, it lasted from the 4th to the 1st BC and for the next 3 centuries. Until the Constantinople became the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Greek writers were conscious of belonging to the world which Rome was centered. So, Hellenistic is a term that later they applied to the cultural output of by age of William Moswitz, the dramatic development in art and literature, philosophy and science that characterize this period are usually attributed with dramatic political, social change and swept over the Greek world after Alexander's death. So, in Hellenistic, the literature only evolves about the death of Alexander the Great, the history and some things that Alexander the Great have done, and also it's about the dramatic and political social changes about the Greece. Next, we have the genres. We have the epic narrative. These genres are the ones that arise during the Greek literature. So we have epic narrative, lyric poetry, tragedy, comedy, history. In the history, the first writer of history was Herodotus of Halicarnassus, who was also a geographer and anthropologist. Next, we have rhetoric and oratory, which is persuasive speech and philosophical prose. It is one of the greatest achievements of the 4th century. It was influenced by Socrates, and it means that the writer dictates rather than the outline of an argument for something. Next is about Greek gods and goddesses, 12 Olympians.
And for the Greek gods and goddesses, the 12 Olympians, the 12 Olympian gods of the Greek mythology, were actually the third generation of gods, and 6 of them having been born of the powerful Titans who had overthrown their father Uranus the sky. The leader of the Titans, Cronus, feared that his children would someday arise against him. To prevent this, he swallowed his children as they were born. In the end, his fears proved correct. For his wife, Rhea concealed their son Zeus and saved him from being ingested. Once grown, Zeus managed to free his siblings, and with the help of their gigantic half-siblings, the Three Cyclops, and 50, 50-headed monsters, the Olympians triumphed over the Titans. They ruled over the affairs of mankind from their palace at the Mount Olympus. In ancient of Greek religion and mythology, the 12 Olympians are the major deities of the Greek pantheon. In ancient Greek mythology, the 12 Olympian gods and goddesses ruled over human affairs and enjoyed parties, fights, and torrid love affairs, as we all know from their palace of Mount Olympus. Why are they called 12 Olympians? The Olympians were a race of deities, primarily consisting of third and fourth generation of immortal beings, worshipped as the principal god of Greek pantheon and so named because of their residency atop Mount Olympus. So first, we have the Aphrodite, who is the goddess of love, romance, and beauty. Her son was Eros, the god of love, though he is not an Olympian. Aphrodite's marriage to Hephaestus was not to her liking, although he crafted intricate jewelry for her as an attempt to woo her affections. She preferred the wild and rough Aris. When Hephaestus learned Aphrodite and Aris' affair, he once again used his craftsmanship to fashion a trap. He placed his invisible web of chains around his bed and trapped Aphrodite and his Aris naked. In the mid of their amorous meetings, he summoned the other gods and goddesses who joined him in mercilessly mocking the ensnared lovers. When they were finally freed, the boat fled to Olympus in humiliation for a short time. Aphrodite also enjoyed a number of flings with mortal humans and is perhaps best known for promising the beautiful, already married Queen Helen to the youth Paris and thus kicking off the legendary Trojan War. Second, we have Apollo, the beautiful god of the sun and light, medicine, and music. Artemis' twin brother Apollo was her exact opposite, the god of the sun, light, music, prophecy, medicine, and knowledge. His oracle of Delphi was the most famous of the ancient world. Apollo won a lyre from his mischievous little brother Hermes, and the instrument became irrevocably linked to the god. Apollo was considered the most handsome of the gods. He was so cheerful and bright and enjoyed singing, dancing, drinking, and was immensely popular among both gods and mortals. He also took after his father in chasing of mortal women, though not always with good success. The river nymph Daphne had her father turn her into a laurel tree rather than succumb to his advances. Third, we have Aris, the dark god of war who loves Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. So Aris was the god of war, but in direct contrast to his sister Athena, where Athena oversaw strategy, tactics, and offensive warfare, Aris reveled in the violence and bloodshed the war produced. His aggressive nature and quick temper made him unpopular with the other Olympians with the exception of Aphrodite, and he was equally disliked among mortals. Next, we have Artemis, the independent goddess of the hunt, the forest, wildlife, childbirth, and the moon, sister to Apollo. Artemis and her twin brother Apollo were the children of Zeus and his fling with the Titaness Leto. Hera threatened every land in the world with a terrible curse if they gave Leto refuge, and prolonged Leto's labor to last an entire 9 months. Yet, despite of all that, the twins were born and became important Olympians. Though they were as different as night and day, Artemis was quiet, dark, and solemn, the goddess of the moon, forest, archery, and the hunt. Like Athena, Artemis has no desire to marry. She was the patron goddess of feminine fertility, chastity, and childbirth, and was also heavily associated with wild animals. The bear was sacred to her. Next, we have Athena, the daughter of Zeus and goddess of wisdom, war, and crops. She presides over the pantheon and her namesake city, Athens, sometimes called Athene. So, Athene was the daughter of Zeus and his first wife, Metis. Fearing that a son would usurp him as he had his father, Zeus swallowed Metis to prevent this. However, Metis survived and fashioned armor for her upcoming child from within Zeus. Eventually, the pounding gave him splitting headache, quite literally, for Hephaestus split Zeus' head open with an axe. From the wood sprang Athena, full-grown and armor-clad. Athena's strength rivaled that any of the other gods. She refused to take any lovers, remaining determinedly virgin. She took her place on Mount Olympus as the goddess of justice, strategic warfare, wisdom, rational thought, and arts and crafts. The owl was one of her most important symbols, and she planted the first olive tree as gift to her favorite namesake city, Athens. Number 6, we have Demeter. So, Demeter is the goddess of agriculture and mother of Persephone, or Persephone. Again, her offspring is not considered to be an Olympian. So, known as the good goddess to the people of the earth, Demeter oversaw farming, agriculture, and the fertility of the earth. Not surprisingly, as she controlled the production of food, she was very highly worshipped in the ancient world. Demeter had only one daughter, who is Persephone, who caught the eye of Zeus's third brother, Hades. Eventually, he abducted the girl and brought her to his gloomy palace in the underworld. Distraught, Demeter searched the entire earth for her daughter and neglected her duties. So for the 7, Hephaestus, or the lame god of fire and the forge, sometimes spelled Hephaestos and Hephaestion, near the Acropolis in the most beautifully preserved ancient temple in Greece, mated to Aphrodite. Accounts differ as to the birth of Hephaestus. Some name him the son of Zeus and Hera. Others say he was conceived by Hera alone in order to get back at Zeus for the birth of Athena. However, Hephaestus was horribly ugly, at least by the standards of gods and goddesses. Repulsed by his appearance, Hera hurled him from Olympus, which left him permanently lame. He learned the blacksmith trade, built himself a workshop, and became the god of fire, metallurgy, sculpture, and the crafts, though to a lesser extent than his sister Athena. Next, we have Hera, or the wife of Zeus, a protector of marriage, familiar with magic. Hera ruled as the queen of the gods. As the goddess of marriage and fidelity, she was one of the only Olympians to remain steadfastly faithful to her spouse. Though faithful, she was also vengeful and tormented many of Zeus's extramarital partners. Next is we have Hermes, the speedy messenger of the god and god of business and wisdom. The Romans called him Mercury. So Hermes had a very diverse collection of skills as the god of trade, eloquence, wealth, luck, sleep, thieves, travel, and animal racing. He is also always characterized as mischievous. He was constantly in search of fun and entertainment. It was his thieving of Apollo's sacred herd of cattle when he was still only a baby that lost him his lyre recompense. As the messenger of the gods, Hermes ran many errands, including killing the monster Argos to release though. Rescuing Aris from his imprisonment by giants and talking to Calypso into freeing Odysseus and his men from her clutches. It was also his duty to escort souls into the underworld. Next, we have Hestia, the calm goddess of home and home life, symbolized by the heart, which holds the continually burning flame. So, Hestia was the final sister of Zeus, but she is often excluded from the official pantheon of 12 Olympians. Hestia was the most gentle of all goddesses and protected the home and the heart. According to the myths, she was originally one of the 12. However, when Dionysus was born, she graciously gave him her throne, insisting that she was happier sitting near and tending to the fire that warmed Olympus. Next, we have Poseidon, as we all know, the god of the sea, horses, and earthquakes. When Zeus became king, he divided the universe amongst himself and his two brothers. Poseidon received dominion over the seas and waters of the world. He also had the power to produce storms, floods, and earthquakes. He was also the protector of seamen and the god of horses. Lastly, we have Zeus, the supreme lord of gods, the god of the sky, symbolized by the thunderbolt. After leading the battle against Cronus, Zeus became the chief god and ruled over the other divinities living their divine mountain. He held dominion over the earth and the sky and was the ultimate arbitrator of law and justice. He controlled the weather, using his ability to hurl thunder and lightning to enforce his reign. Zeus' first wife was Metis, one of the Titan sisters. He later married his own sister, Hera, but he had a wandering eye and a penchant for flings with any and all women. His romantic interests gave him numerous other gods, demigods, and mortal heroes of the earth. So please remember that the other brother of Zeus, Hades, is also not considered as an Olympian, as he did not live in the divine palace. Hades was the god of death, overseeing the underworld and the souls that came there. He was not welcome among the other gods or mortals, and is usually described as sour, stern, and unsympathetic individual. Despite this, he caused less trouble than his brother Poseidon, who's one of the occasion attempted a revolt against Zeus. Hades also had a soft spot for his wife Persephone. So the Six Olympians, if you're wondering who's the Six Olympians, while we generally think today of the 12 Olympians, there was a smaller core group of just six who were just the children of Cronus and Freya. The first is there are Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus. In that group, Hades is always included.
I'm Edwin M. Helen II, and we're going to be moving on to the next topic of the report, which is the Trojan War. So the Trojan War is one of the most famous conflicts in human history, but we're going to be looking at the mythological side of the story. So the story first begins with rulers of Troy, King Priam and his wife Hecuba expecting a second-born child. But an oracle prophesies that their second-born child is to bring about the total destruction of Troy. So the king ordered a shepherd by the name of Angelus to get rid of the child and kill it. So the shepherd took the child and brought it to the feet of Mount Ida and left it there for it to die. So a few days later, nakonsensya yung shepherd and binalikan niya yung bata. And he was shocked to find that the child was still alive and took it as a sign that it was not the child's destiny to die. And he took the child and raised it as his own. He named the child Paris. And Paris grew up to be a handsome-looking young man. And he was also a shepherd, just like his father. So, the next part of the story will be about the golden apple. So, how does this begin? It begins with a banquet at the wedding of King Peleus and a she nymph by the name of Thetis. So, all of the gods and goddesses were invited at this wedding except for one, which is Aris, the goddess of discord. So, she was angry by this that she was not invited to the banquet. She wanted to cause some trouble. So she crashed the wedding and tossed the golden apple in the middle of the gathering. So the golden apple has words engraved in it, which is to the fairest. So all the goddesses fought over it until only three of them remained, which is Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. So they asked Zeus to judge them and who does this apple really belongs to. But Zeus decided that he won't judge them and decided to leave the judgment to a mortal named Paris. So he ordered Hermes to take the three of them to the feet of Mount Ida and brought the three of them to Paris for judgment. So each and every one of them bribed Paris for them to gain his side. So Hera offered Paris to become the ruler of Europe and Asia. Athena offered him wisdom and that he may be the greatest warrior. And lastly, Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman, love from the most beautiful woman in the world. So Paris could not resist this offer and chose Aphrodite and handed her the golden apple. So the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen of Sparta. But there was only one problem. Helen of Sparta was already married. She is the wife of the king of Sparta, King Menelaus. So, by the blessing of Aphrodite, Paris went to Sparta and abducted Helen and made her his wife. When King Menelaus came back to their kingdom, he was angry by this news that Paris of Troy took his wife. So he ordered his brother, King Agamemnon, to lead an army to siege the city of Troy. But before that, they attempted pala to take Helen in a diplomatic way, but they failed. So they gathered an army together with one of the Greek heroes, Achilles. So that was the beginning of the siege of Troy. So the Greek army laid siege to the city of Troy, but the city of Troy was so fortified that it took them so long with very little progress. And there was this conflict between Achilles and King Agamemnon that caused Achilles to withdraw himself from battle. But a close friend of Achilles by the name of Patroclus was killed wearing his armor by Hector. Hector was the firstborn son of King Priam. So this was the driving force of Achilles to go back to battle. And then in a one-to-one combat, he killed Hector. But during one of the many battles in Troy, Achilles was killed by Paris. He was shot in the ankle, which was the only vulnerable part of his body. After that, the one of their allies, King Odysseus, thought of an idea, and this idea was the infamous Trojan horse. So they made the Trojans believe that they were withdrawing and retreating from battle, but actually they were inside the horse that they left in there. So the Trojans took the horse inside of the city walls, and the Greek warriors came out of it, and that's how they won the battle, and that's how they destroyed Troy.
Alfayous and Arithusa. Arithusa was a singularly beautiful nymph and is the goddess of hunting and knowledge. She is a daughter of Nereus and Doris. Alpheus was the river god. Arethusa was hunting when she saw a sparkling lake and decided to swim. When Arethusa was swimming, she felt something weird underneath her and decided to get out. A voice asked why she was leaving, and Arethusa was scared, so she ran away. Alpheus was the unknown voice and told her to stop running because he loved her. Arethusa kept running, and when she was tired, she prayed to her goddess Artemis. Artemis turned her into a spring of water and made a tunnel for the water to flow to Sicily. Alpheus also turned into a river to follow her, and it is said that the two bodies of waters mingle. Daphne and Apollo. Apollo was the god of life, and it was his job to pull the sun across the sky in his four-horse chariot every day. He has also been referred to as the god of music, poetry, art, medicine, knowledge, plague, and archery. Daphne was a naiad nymph. Greek mythology states that Apollo had been mocking the god of love, Eros. In retaliation, Eros fired two arrows, a gold arrow that struck Apollo and made him fall in love with Daphne, and a lead arrow that made Daphne hate Apollo. Under the spell of the arrow, Apollo continued to follow Daphne, but she continued to reject him. Apollo told Daphne that he would love her forever. Daphne then turned to the river god Peneus and pleaded for him to free her from Apollo. In response, Peneus used metamorphosis to turn Daphne into a laurel tree. Apollo used his powers of eternal youth and immortality to make Daphne's laurel leaves evergreen. It is believed that Daphne must sacrifice her body and turn into a tree, as this was the only way she could avoid Apollo's sexual advances. Further facts about Apollo and Daphne. After Daphne had been transformed into a laurel, Apollo made the plant sacred and vowed to wear it as a cloth. Eros fired the two arrows into Apollo and Daphne because Apollo had been making fun of him. Apollo had recently been victorious and won Python, an earth dragon, and told Aris that his godly talents were useless compared to his own. Aris fired the arrows from the top of Mount Parnassus. In the Greek language, the word for laurel is Daphne. The laurel became the symbol of Apollo and the symbol of poetry. Every 4 years, a laurel wreath would be given to the winner of the Pythian Games. These games were held in honor of Apollo. Endymion. Endymion in Greek mythology is a beautiful youth who spent much of his life in perpetual sleep. Endymion's parentage varies among the different ancient references and stories, but several traditions say that he was originally the king of Elis. According to one tradition, Zeus offered him anything that he might desire, and Endymion chose an everlasting sleep in which he might remain youthful forever. According to another version of the myth, Endymion's eternal sleep was a punishment inflicted by Zeus because he had attempted to have a sexual relationship with Zeus's wife, Hera. In any case, Endymion was loved by Selene, the goddess of the moon, who visited him every night while he lay asleep in a cave on Mount Latmos in Caria. She bore him 50 daughters. A common form of the myth represents Endymion as having been put to sleep by Selene herself so that she might enjoy his beauty undisturbed. Baucis and Philemon. Philemon, an elderly man, and Baucis, his wife of many years, lived together in a small cottage in Phrygia. They led a tough but happy life, and they were always kind to one another and to the others too. As they sat one afternoon in their humble home, they could never have guessed what amazing thing was about to happen to them. That very morning, Zeus had sat on his throne on Mount Olympus, feeling bored. He decided to visit the earth and have an adventure. He chose Hermes, the messenger of God, to accompany him. The two disguised themselves as humans and then set off for the earth. On this day, they planned to visit the land of Phrygia and find out how welcoming the people were. Zeus cared a great deal about hospitality. After all, anyone who was a guest away from home would pray to him for protection. When Zeus and Hermes arrived on earth, they began knocking on doors and begging for food for shelter. The residents of the homes, whether mansions or huts, all responded in the same way. Each time, the door was slammed in the gods' faces. The people had no clue that they were turning away two of the gods. After trying hundreds of houses, the two gods felt extremely disappointed. Finally, they came to a tiny cottage. As they knocked on the door, Zeus and Hermes prepared themselves for more disappointment. To their surprise, however, the residents opened the door wide. Baucis and Philemon cheerfully ushered the two strangers into their home and introduced themselves. They didn't have much, they said, but they would do their best to make their guests feel welcome. The couple served the strangers food and wine. And then, a very strange thing happened. Baucis and Philemon noticed that the wine bowl remained full even though many cups had been poured. Their guests must be gods. Philemon then decided that he should catch and kill his pet goose to offer it to these gods. However, the old man was no match for the fast young goose and was unable to catch it. Zeus laughed and decided the couple had done enough. He led them outside and up a mountain. As Baucis and Philemon looked back, they saw that the entire countryside had been covered in water. All of their neighbors had been punished for turning away the gods. The only building that remained was their own cottage, which was now transformed into a beautiful temple. Zeus then offered the couple a wish. Baucis and Philemon decided that they would like to serve as priests in the temple. They also wanted to be allowed to die at the same time since they had lived together for so long. Neither of them wanted to live alone. The gods were happy with this wish and returned to the Mount Olympus. Baucis and Philemon served in the temple for a long time. One day, They both died at the same time, and leaves and bark began growing around them. The two became trees, an oak and a linden tree, which shared a single trunk. People came from far and wide to see this miraculous tribute to such a pious couple. Pygmalion and Galatea. Pygmalion was a talented Greek sculptor from Cyprus. After becoming disgusted by some local prostitutes, he lost all interest in women and avoided their company completely. Pygmalion saw women as flawed creatures and vowed never to waste any moment in his life with them. He dedicated himself to his work and soon created Galatea, a beautiful statue of a woman out of ivory. Ironically, the masterpiece of his life was this statue of a woman. Perhaps he sought to correct in marble the flaws he saw in women of flesh and blood. Whatever the case, Pygmalion worked so long and with such inspiration on the statue of Galatea that it became more beautiful than any woman that had ever lived or been carved in stone. As he finished the statue's features, they became exquisitely lovely, and he found himself applying the strokes of hammer and chisel with increasing affection. When his chisel finally stopped ringing, there stood before him a woman of such perfection that Pygmalion, who had professed his disdain of all females, fell deeply in love. He would bring it gifts, caress it, kiss it, and talk to it every day. He brought it gifts he thought women would enjoy, such as pretty seashells, beads, songbirds, bubbles, and flowers. He would dress the statue in fine clothing and put rings on her fingers, necklaces, and around her neck, and even earrings. However, what irony that he who had scorned women should fall in love with a woman who could never love him in return. Such a passion could not go unnoticed by the goddess of love, Aphrodite. She took pity on the young man, and when Pygmalion went to her temple to sacrifice a bull, Aphrodite gave him a sign. As the offering burned on the temple, the flames shot up 1, 2, 3 times. Pygmalion went home, wondering what to make of the manifestation he had seen. When he entered the studio, however, and saw the statue, all other thoughts were banished from his mind. He ran to his statue and embraced it. Did she seem warm to his touch, or was it just residual heat from the sunset that had warmed the stone? He kissed her. Did the statue's lips seem soft? He stood back and regarded her. Did there appear the glow of life from within a marble form? Was he imagining it? No. Aphrodite had given life to the statue, whose name was Galatea. Pygmalion's mind oscillated between doubt and joy. Fearing he may be mistaken, again and again with a lover's ardor, he touches the object of his hopes. It was indeed alive. The veins, when pressed, yielded to the finger and again resumed their roundness. Slowly, it dawned on Pygmalion that the animation of his sculpture was a result of his prayer to goddess Aphrodite, who knew his desire. At last, the votary of Aphrodite found words to thank the goddess. Pygmalion humbled himself at the goddess's feet. Soon, Pygmalion and Galatea were wed, and Pygmalion never forgot to thank Aphrodite for the gift she had given him. Aphrodite blessed the nuptials she had formed, and this union between Pygmalion and Galatea produced a son named Paphos, from whom the city of Paphos in Cyprus received its name. Pygmalion and Galatea brought gifts to her temple throughout their life, and Aphrodite blessed them with happiness and love in return. Ceyx and Alcyone. Ceyx, the son of the morning star, was the king of the Greek city of Trachis. He was married to Alcyone, whose father Aeolus was the keeper of the winds. They are married happily until the day when Ceyx decides to journey across the ocean. Knowing the dangers of the sea, Alcyone begs him not to go, or at least to take her with him. But Ceyx declines her offer and sets out without her. On the first night of the journey, a storm ravages his ship, and Ceyx dies with Alcyone's name on his lips. Alcyone continues to wait for her husband, making him cloaks and praying fruitlessly to Hera for his safe return. Hera pities the woman and asks Somnus, god of sleep, to tell her truth about her husband's death. Somnus sends his son Morpheus to break the news in a dream. So Morpheus takes the form of the drowned Ceyx. Alcyone wakes up from the terrible dream and knows her husband has died. She goes into the ocean to drown herself and to be with him, but she sees his body floating towards her. She dives in but miraculously flies over the waves instead of sinking into them. The gods have turned her into a bird. The body of Ceyx disappears and Ceyx turns into a bird as well. They are still together, flying and in love. Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus was a legendary musician, poet, and prophet in ancient Greek religion and myth. It is the told where he met his wife and how he courted her, but it is known that no maiden Orpheus desired could have resisted the power of his music. Sadly, immediately after the wedding, as Eurydice, his wife, walked in the meadow with her bridesmaids, a viper stung her and she died. Orpheus' grief was so great that he vowed to go down to the world of death and try to bring Eurydice back. He traveled to the underworld and by his music softened the hearts of Hades and Persephone, who agreed to allow Eurydice to return to him to earth on one condition. He should walk in front of her and not look back until they both had reached the upper world. He set off with Eurydice following, and in his anxiety, as soon as he reached the upper world, he turned to look at her, forgetting that both needed to be in the upper world, and she vanished for the second time, but now forever.